Şimdi saygıdeğer konuklarımız, sunumlarını yapacak olan konuşmacılarımızla devam ediyor programımız. Öncelikle ben sizlere kendisinin özgeçmişini kısaca aktarmak istiyorum. Amerikalı yazar, siyaset bilimci ve politik yorumcu. West Brookings Enstitüsü'nde Teknoloji ve İnovasyon Merkezi Direktörü ve Yönetişim Çalışmaları Başkan Yardımcısı ve Direktörüdür. Teknoloji politikaları, kitle iletişim araçları ve ABD seçim ve seçim kampanyaları hakkında yazıları bulunmaktadır. Alkışlarınızla konuşmacımız Darrell West geliyor.
Thank you. It is a pleasure to be back in Ankara. I was here 4 years ago, and it is impressive to see all the growth and development that has taken place during that time. Your skyline has changed pretty dramatically. Lots of new buildings have gone up. Other ones are in the process of going up. So my compliments to all the prosperity that we see in this area. I have to say, it's a tough act following all those ministers that we just heard, and the business leaders as well. I actually learned a lot about ICT in Turkey. There for a while, we were getting the dueling statements from the ministers. I thought we were going to jump into a parliamentary question period. The Republicans and Democrats here sound just like the Republicans and Democrats in Washington, D.C. Today, I'd like to talk about new developments in technology and e-government in particular. And I want to focus on the public sector because that is a pressing problem in most countries around the world. In the United States, for example, we have a $1.6 trillion budget deficit. And so it's obvious we need to figure out how to get more effective in the delivery of government services. We need to improve worker productivity in the public sector. We need for government to do a much better job than it is doing. In the United States, as well as in many other countries around the world, there is massive public cynicism about government. The average person on the street thinks government doesn't know what it's doing, and it's not very effective, and it's not getting the job done. Technology can offer some help in that regard. And then, as my slide shows, there are numerous policy challenges facing leaders around the world in terms of economic development, healthcare, education, and other types of things. In the United States, and certainly in Western Europe, economic growth is very anemic. And the interesting thing is, as several of the speakers earlier alluded to, technology can be a powerful driver of economic development. On this slide, I show figures that show the very strong association between broadband development and economic development. There was a World Bank study that came out 2 or 3 years ago that looked at 120 nations around the world. And what that study showed was that for each 10-point increase in broadband penetration, that it added 1.2% to GDP growth in developed nations and nearly 1.4% in developing nations. So we can see the ways in which broadband and technology innovation in general is very important to all of our economic futures. Certainly, when we look at innovation in the private sector, there's been tremendous progress. Here we have one obvious example that we all know, the automated teller machines in banks. When we go to airports, we now have automated check-in processes. So there are lots of ways in which the private sector has led the way in showing how to automate some of the more routine tasks and create greater worker productivity and greater efficiency for the system as a whole. So the question is, how can we bring that same sense of innovation that we see in many parts of the private sector to the public sector? And here, there are 4 different new models of electronic government, or 4 components: collaboration, interactive features, sharing, and participation. Technology can help improve government performance in each of these areas. Collaboration is certainly an area where government needs to do a better job. Every government, I've given technology talks in probably 25 nations around the world. Every place that I've been, people complain about government, and the particular complaint that I hear almost everywhere is the fragmentation of government agencies, the fragmentation of government departments, that government officials don't work together, the agencies are very siloed, that they're simply not very effective in working together. This certainly has been a problem in the United States. When President Obama came into office 4 years ago, we had a pattern where the technology innovation at the federal government level was department by department and agency by agency. That leads to great inefficiencies in the system. You don't get the economies of scale in terms of procurement and purchasing information technology. So one of the first things President Obama did when he went into office was to develop a new position that previously had not existed, called the Chief Technology Officer. This was an advisor who reported directly to the president, and that person's job was to try and integrate technology across the departments, to try and think about innovation more generally, to think about new developments and how the government can get more effective. The federal government in the United States spends $80 billion a year on information technology, but we don't get $80 billion worth of services. So improving collaboration is kind of the first step to improving government performance. But it's also important to focus on the interactive aspects of technology and how technology can make a major difference at that level. The old style of government is one-way communications, that leaders basically talk to citizens. In the new form of e-government, we need to think about two-way communications, where leaders talk to citizens, but citizens talk to leaders and give them feedback, what's going well, what's not going so well, how can a service be improved. And a few years ago, I was visiting Beijing, China for the first time. And I noticed an interesting application of technology, which I've never seen anywhere else around the world. So I landed at the airport, I'm going through the passport office, and you know, this is the first government bureaucrat that you encounter in any country, the passport person. So I handed the guy my passport, he's looking it over. I happened to look down, and there was an electronic device that allowed me to rate the performance of that passport officer on a 1 to 4 scale. And I wasn't sure what the 4 settings meant. I guess 4 meant the person did a good job, 1 meant the person should be sent away and shot someplace. But you know, when you just think about kind of what that meant in terms of the Chinese government was trying to improve government performance, and it created a new electronic version of accountability for that individual bureaucrat. And they were doing that kind of in a more general way. So I just thought it was an interesting example of technology innovation in the public sector. Participation, getting more people involved in decision making is something that technology enables. In the United States, when people go to government websites and order services or pay their taxes online or do the variety of things that we now can do, there are pop-up surveys that randomly choose web visitors and ask them a series of about 15 questions to rate their satisfaction with that interaction with government. Did they find the government website useful? Did they find the information that they were seeking? Were they able to perform the electronic transaction in which they were interested? And so what we now do is we aggregate those responses across agencies, and 4 times a year there are ratings that come out that basically rate all of the government agencies on a performance metric, on each of the dimensions that I talked about, basically using customer responses to evaluate government. It's another way to try and use technology to improve public sector performance. And sharing information obviously is important. Governments always are reactive. They need to start getting proactive. For example, the old model of government was, let's say a farmer is planting certain crops. He discovers he needs certain information, and he'll go to a government office, and the government person will give him the information or provide the service that is requested. That's okay, but think about an alternative vision of government that's more proactive. On a lot of American government websites, you can register your interest in particular things. So let's say if you visited the Iowa State Department of Agriculture and said you raised corn, and you were interested in getting up-to-date information on that subject, instead of waiting for that farmer to go to government to get information, whenever there's a change in market conditions, global trade, international things that might affect the sale of corn to other countries, the government agency automatically emails that material to the farmer. It's a different model of government, more proactive and less reactive. I think that there are several things that offer the potential to be transformative in the way that government performs its basic functions. On this slide, I list 4 different things that have the potential to transform government: mobile technology, data analytics, GIS mapping, and social media. And let me just briefly talk about each of those things. Mobile technology is interesting. This past spring, I went to Barcelona to the World Mobile Congress. There were thousands of people interested in mobile technology. And what researchers there predicted was that by 2016, 80% of the broadband subscriptions around the world are going to be through mobile devices, either smartphones or tablets. That's a rapid transformation in the way people communicate, the way they acquire information, the way they get services. This obviously has big ramifications for the private sector as well as the public sector. But mobile devices provide convenience for the user, and so government agencies need to start to configure their operations for this new mobile world. And so they need to start to think about ways that they can do this. In Tokyo, for example, as in many major cities around the world, traffic congestion is a big problem. By the way, people told me in Ankara that along with the economic development that you've experienced, somehow traffic is getting worse as well. Well, let me tell you what they're doing in Tokyo. Like in Tokyo, traffic is a problem and parking is a problem. And so they have developed mobile apps in which if you're driving around and you're trying to find the least crowded route to your destination, you can log on to this mobile app on your cell phone and it'll tell you what's the road that is least congested, where you can get to where you're going. If you're looking for a parking place, they've tagged the parking places and they have sensors for whether that parking place is empty or full, and they will tell you where the empty parking places are. And so, again, it's a different way of thinking about government. As opposed to us spending minutes or sometimes longer stuck in traffic or trying to find that parking place, mobile technology offers a way for government to do a better job in a very practical and concrete way that people really appreciate. Data analytics is a big growth area as well. Governments sit on a gold mine of information because what do governments do? They collect information. But most governments don't share that information. That's something that needs to change. Data analytics basically allows, once you create the data sharing networks and once you move to more of an open data policy, it basically allows either the government agencies themselves or private sector companies or nonprofit organizations or researchers to start to make use of that information on an anonymized basis and aggregate it for useful purposes. This is something that I think will be very useful. In Beijing, when I was there on a technology delegation, we visited some of the call centers that they have established, and it's very interesting what the Beijing government does. They essentially track the consumer complaints that are coming in by neighborhood as well as by department, and they treat it as a running public opinion survey. If a particular neighborhood, the complaints skyrocket, or if a particular government agency, particular bureaucrats aren't doing their job and there are a lot of citizen complaints, they take that to be a problem that needs to be solved. There's a lot of construction in Beijing, so one of the constant problems is, there's construction collection garbage in my neighborhood. And so they'll send someone out with a camera to take a picture of the garbage once they get the complaint coming in. And then they notify the bureaucrat in charge of that, and they basically give them 2 or 3 hours to clean that up, and then they send somebody back 2 or 3 hours later, again with the camera, and that debris had better be picked up. So again, it's a new way to think about improving responsiveness to citizens, providing devices by which people can complain about things they don't like, and improving accountability in the public sector, which we know is a big problem. GIS mapping is a big growth area. In Washington, D.C., where I live, the police department has an interactive map in which you can enter any address in the city and it will list the crime statistics for that particular neighborhood. Within 1 block of that address, or 2 blocks, or 3 blocks, or 4 blocks, you can specify the range. So when my wife and I moved to D.C. 4 years ago, we were looking to buy a house. We found this invaluable to check out particular neighborhoods. Now, that's the good news. The bad news is D.C. is actually a scary place. Like, you know, if you start looking at the crime statistics by neighborhood, it will scare you to death. And so we were kind of put in a situation looking at 3 different neighborhoods, and we had to figure out what was our tolerance for crime. You know, was it 30 crimes a month, 60 crimes a month, or 90 crimes a month? So and of course there are price differentials associated with each of those crime gradients. So we went for the medium level, about 60 crimes a month, and I have to say in the last 4 years we've had 4 bicycles stolen. So it sounds about right. But, you know, again, it's a way for government to take the information that it has and put it in a form that's really helpful to the average person. Social media can do exactly the same thing. It provides a device for people to share their experiences. In the United States, in the campaign that we just went through, social media was really big. It was actually one of the reasons why President Obama was able to win re-election. He combined social media and data analytics in very creative sorts of ways. But social media also are very relevant in the governance process because it connects people, it allows people to share experiences, it improves responsiveness, and it improves accountability. So when you look at all of these things taken together, we actually have the pieces to transform government. One of the things that I did when I was at Brown University before I moved to Brookings is we did e-government performance metrics by country on an annual basis. So we studied I think there were 192 nations around the world at that time. We looked at about 24 different performance metrics for those websites, and then we rated each country, and then we aggregated it by region. So in this particular slide, we list the e-government performance by region. North America did well, Asia and Europe did well, and then you start to see a fall off with South America and Africa basically being the places that had the greatest challenge. We also looked at individual nations, some of the leading nations that we found. South Korea is tremendous. Those of you who are wanting to improve e-government in Turkey, look to South Korea. They're doing amazing things. Several of the speakers earlier today commented on South Korea as a model in different sorts of ways. It's also a model in terms of electronic government. In general, we found several Asian countries really jumping ahead of the United States and some of the European nations. Singapore does a great job. Taiwan does a great job as well. We also did some country-by-country comparisons. Turkey does well on some dimensions. For example, we found in terms of providing online services, many of the government websites did offer that feature. In terms of having online publications that citizens could access, Turkey did well. In terms of providing foreign language instruction, Turkey rated very highly. So we looked at a number of different dimensions just to kind of get a sense of how governments were performing through electronic government, and then we made recommendations on how they can do a better job. And by the way, these studies are all available and are online at the Brookings website at brookings.edu if any of you are interested in more of the details. These are United States data that shows the percentage of the American public that actually accesses online services. And so we see that about 65% of Americans pay their income taxes online, about 40% go online for government data, 33% have renewed their driver's license or auto registration online. So these are three of the aspects that are very popular among the general public. These are particular features that people are starting to access. But you can see there are a lot of people outside the technology revolution in the United States. There are a third of the people who basically don't really access the internet. We need to do a better job of closing that digital divide. 2/3 of the people don't renew their driver's license online. They go to the physical site where one can do it. But then if you look at the last two numbers that I have here, we can see that e-government does better than e-democracy. The last two items here that I've listed are measures of e-democracy, meaning as opposed to just government seeing its role as delivering services, we look at whether government is improving the process of governing and engaging people in the act of governance. And what we found were actually pretty disappointing results. Only 23% said that they participated in online debates about government policy, and only 13% had read a government blog. So you can see that despite the potential for e-government that I've talked about earlier, governments still have a long way to go. There are a couple of examples that I want to give of kind of interesting things that have popped up. One of President Obama's initiatives was to put more government data online. So he created this website called data.gov. And basically, what this does is Obama went to every federal agency and every department in 2009 and said, I want 3 data sets that your agency collects that is not currently available to the general public or to the business community. And so they then took all this information. So there now are hundreds of data sets available at data.gov that previously were unavailable either to the public or to businesses. And so this is an example of car safety ratings. There is a database that covers 20 years of data, and it basically looks at vehicle safety by car company as well as by particular make of car. And the data is updated on a daily basis, so it's about as close to real time as you can get. It rates vehicles on the crash worthiness of a vehicle, like if it's involved in a crash, how likely is the car to hold up, whether the car rolls over when it's in an accident, what happens during controlled crash tests where they measure the safety features of a vehicle. And then you can see on the on my right-hand side of this chart, you can actually download this data into an Excel file or some other spreadsheet, and then you can manipulate the data as you would like. You can also rate this website and this particular database in terms of whether it was helpful to you. And so you can start to see ways in which governments are getting much more creative about using the internet to make information available and to put it in a form that people can actually access. We're seeing the same thing in terms of government blogs. Here's an example of the TSA blog. TSA is the Transportation and Safety Administration. It's the government agency that operates airports in the United States. And what it does is it allows people to basically talk about their travel experiences. And as you know, since 9/11, airport security is beefed up. So it means that it's a much bigger hassle getting through American airports than used to be the case, because you have all the safety stuff and you have to take the liquids out. And so basically, you can check how long the lines are at any airport in the United States by looking at this blog. And you can also get traveler feedback on what their experience was in particular airports. You know, what they liked about the airport, what they didn't like about it. So it's kind of a big complaint platform for people to offer their opinions about what's happening in their travel experiences, and the government then makes this information available to everybody else to be able to see. Cloud computing is something that is starting to take off in the United States. I don't know how extensively it's used in Turkey, but there are tremendous cost savings associated with cloud computing. We did a research project where we looked at the city of Los Angeles and the city of Washington, D.C. as it moved its email services to cloud platforms. And the city of Los Angeles found about a 24% cost saving. The city of Washington, D.C. found a 48% cost saving. So there are tremendous cost savings to be had through technology. And so in an era where government needs to get more efficient, resources are limited, and in the case of Europe and in the United States where we have big deficits, there are ways in which we can actually maintain the same level of service delivery or even improve on the service delivery, but do so at a cheaper cost. Here is a chart that basically shows some of the new applications that are coming online and what the bandwidth that is going to be required for each of those applications. There are lots of interesting new features that are developing. There's a lot of interest, for example, in terms of high-definition television. The internet is basically moving from a text-based world of words to a video-based world. People want multimedia applications. They want video. You know, we're kind of used to video in the rest of our lives in terms of TVs, movies, and other online platforms. And so people basically want more video, either on private sector sites or on government sites and so on. And what a lot of people don't realize is the bandwidth that is required for example, high-definition television is going to be 18 megabits per second. So we need faster broadband than what many people have today in the United States as well as around the world. Online gaming is really taking off. One of the speakers, one of the ministers mentioned the emphasis on gaming. Gaming is actually emerging both as important in the entertainment world as well as in the world of education. In the United States, we're developing online games for instructional purposes. For example, especially in the areas of math and science, there's a lot of interest and lots of ways in which you can engage students and help them learn math concepts and science concepts through online games. But again, the bandwidth requirement is going to be very substantial. The same thing is true in terms of video on demand, video conferencing. I mean, all of these require much faster broadband. I have an experience in the United States where in my office I have really fast broadband. It's about 49 megabits per second. But in my home through wireless, my average broadband speed is about 4 megabits per second. And so you can see that through mobile technology and wireless applications, there's a lot of potential, but every country around the world, with the exception of South Korea, which already is at like 100 megabits per second, virtually every other place is going to have to pretty dramatically improve access to broadband as well as the broadband speed if you're going to take advantage of the new things that are coming online. There are lots of interesting new applications, even beyond the public sector, in terms of education, in terms of instructional materials, where you need fast broadband. Also, in the healthcare area, we spend a lot of time at Brookings looking at health information technology. For example, if you go to a doctor, the doctor takes an X-ray, and you want to get a second opinion. What you have to do now in the United States is basically you go to the first doctor, you physically take the X-ray, you go to the second doctor, ask that person to give his or her opinion of the X-ray. So it's a real hassle. In the future, what we're aiming for is when you need a second opinion, that your first doctor, with your permission, can electronically email through a secure platform your X-ray to that second doctor and get the opinion. It's a tremendous time saver. There's going to be efficiencies in terms of the cost of medical care. We have mobile apps that we're already seeing in the United States where doctors can download certain diagnostic tests to their smartphone. And so they can, like if they're going from room to room in a hospital and the patient has a particular question about his or her treatment, the doctor can download that medical test that might have been taken a day or two before, look at it, show it to the patient, discuss the situation, and that's a tremendous advance in terms of technology, but again, it requires very fast broadband. We're also starting to see the use of remote monitoring devices where we have devices that can record vital signs, rates of respiration, heartbeat levels, and so on, and electronically transmit that information to your physician. The physician or the nurse assistant will look at the information, and if there's a problem, they contact you and say, hey, there's a problem. You know, the last reading we got, you know, your rate is too high, or if you're suffering from diabetes, your sugar level has risen over the last month. You know, we need to do something about it. So there are very exciting education applications, there are very exciting healthcare applications that are coming online, but all of them are going to require much faster broadband. So the last thing I want to talk about is just a few policy recommendations that we are emphasizing in the United States as well as in some places around the world. Now, every country kind of has to tailor the internet and broadband and mobile technology for its particular country, its particular culture, and its particular values. So not every set of recommendation that might be relevant for one country is relevant for another. But some of the things that we have found in our research on electronic government is it's actually interesting when you look around the world at the countries that have done the best job of innovating in the public sector. It tends to be centralized countries, like places like South Korea and Singapore and Taiwan. They're very big on central planning. What they're doing is they're basically kind of looking at their future 5, 10, and 20 years down the road and saying, these are the areas where we want to be good. And then they put a lot of public resources into them. Most of the rest of the world is much more decentralized in its approach and relies much more heavily on the private sector as opposed to the public resources to deliver information. So one of the things we suggest is the importance of government-wide contracts in order for the public sector to get the economies of scale so that when they buy information technology, they get the best price for the products that they are purchasing. It's a way for governments to overcome, especially democratic governments, to overcome the fragmentation and the decentralization that we see. That imposes a high cost on technology innovation. So when you're thinking about innovation in the public sector and how to get your governments to perform better and to get more bang for your buck out of the tax dollar, think about the procurement process and the contracting problem, because sometimes that can be a barrier to innovation and sometimes that can drive up costs. So it's something that you need to think about. A lot of countries are moving towards public-private partnerships in which they recognize that government departments don't have an infinite amount of resources, that there are limits to what they can do, and so they have to leverage the private resources of the commercial sector and business companies. So I think that's an important aspect. It's important to tie government agency resources to performance. Like if you really want to improve responsiveness and you really want to improve accountability, you need to develop performance metrics for different agencies and then hold them accountable. You know, publish the results. And then agencies that do well, they get a bonus. Agencies that don't do so well, they don't do so well. So that there's real accountability in the process. If you change the incentives, you're going to change the performance. That rule, which economists have taught us, applies virtually everywhere around the world. It's also important to create data sharing networks so that we can take advantage of the information resources that are around us. I mean, I like the fact that this conference is sponsored by a society and an association that calls itself Informatics, because that really is the key to the future. It's not just getting the information, it's making use of the information to improve decision making. That's true in the public sector, it's true in the education area, it's true in the healthcare area. For those of you who would like additional information on some of the things I've talked about, either in terms of ways to improve government performance, ways to integrate technology in the education process, or ways to use health information technology to improve that process, we have a lot of reports that we have online at our website at Brookings. So that's www.brookings.edu. That's brookings.edu. All of our reports are free and available to the public. So if there are particular aspects of this where you would like additional information, we're happy to make those reports available. So thank you very much. I appreciate your attention.